Okay. Thought that was... Good afternoon. My name is Paul Edwards. I direct the Wheatley Institute at Brigham Young University, and on behalf of Wheatley Institute, the American Enterprise Institute, the Deseret News, and the Center for the Study of Elections and Democracy at Brigham Young University, we're really glad that you can join us for this 10th annual release of the American Family Survey. And I just wanted to say a couple of words about its origin and its aspirations. Back in about 2010, the Deseret News began to do even more focused work on trying to provide research-based journalism that brought attention to concerns around issues related to the family and some other areas of emphasis that the Deseret News had. At the time, I was editor of Deseret News, and we had great correspondents working with us, Lois Collins, who's with us today, doing terrific work in this area. One thing we recognized was that in trying to do our own data-based analysis of different trends, that we were reliant on other people's surveys. And often that was very helpful, but not always did it probe issues that were relevant to what we wanted to do in our coverage. And so we gathered together a group of experts on the family, people like Brad Wilcox, who's with us today, Carlin Bowman, who's with us today. We had the late Sarah McClanahan with us, Catherine Eden, Richard Reeves, together with Jeremy Pope and Chris Karpowitz, who were the principal investigators on this. And that was the emergence of the idea of putting together an annual survey. We didn't know at the time that it would go beyond year 1. And here we are to year 10, and I think we've been able to present the findings here at AEI at least 4 or 5 times. Other times we've been over at Brookings. So anyway, we hope that this provides a useful tool to policymakers here in Washington, D.C. as they engage on important issues. We know that there are some bills up about child tax credit this year that I think have some, could benefit from some of the guidance that's provided in this kind of work. We'll have a great discussion today. Thank you so much for joining us. I wanted to also introduce Sarah Jane Weaver, now the editor at Deseret News, who has a couple of words to say. Sarah?
Thanks. I'm so glad that Paul was able to share some of the history. For 175 years, the Deseret News has been publishing content that we hoped supports the family. Because we care so much about the family as the bedrock of society, that is why 10 years ago we worked to launch this survey, and are so grateful for all of the partners who are in this room who have made that possible. And as we all believe, we want to make a strong society, and we know the way to do that is to make strong men and women. And the strongest men and women who are the most resilient and stable come from strong families. And so we're so grateful to be part of this effort, and looking forward to participating and hearing the results today.
Great. Well, we have a lot of people to hear from today, so I'm going to move through this pretty quickly. I'm Daniel Cox. I'm a senior fellow at AEI and the director of the Survey Center on American Life. Thank you all for coming today. I'm delighted to host the release of the 10th annual American Family Survey. So real quickly, I run a show. Chris and Jeremy are going to give a brief overview, and then we're going to jump into a panel discussion, and we have a great number of people with us. I'm going to do a quick introduction of them, and then I'll turn it over to Chris and Jeremy. So we have Melissa Carney is the Neil Moskowitz Professor of Economics at University of Maryland, a research associate at the National Bureau of Economics Research, and a senior fellow at Brookings. Dr. Carney is also director of the Aspen Economic Strategy Group. She studies family, social policy, and income inequality. Galena Rhodes is a research professor in psychology and the director of the Institute for Relationship Science at the University of Denver. Her research focuses on romantic relationship formation, predictors of relationship success, and couple and family intervention programs. And lastly, Brad Wilcox is a senior fellow here at AI and a professor of sociology at the University of Virginia. He is the director of the Home Economics Project, in which he studies the interaction between family and the economy. So we have a lot of smart people doing a lot of great research, but I want to turn it over to Chris and Jeremy now, who can walk us through this really fascinating study, and then we'll begin our discussion. So,
thanks. Thanks, Dan. It's great to be here. So many people in this room who have been supportive of this project over the years, and we're excited to talk about the findings for the 10th year of the survey. We began in 2015, and each year we fielded the survey through YouGov to their online panel. The 3,000 Americans, and the sample is designed to reflect the population of the United States. Every year, we've had a core set of questions that we've asked so we can track some trends over time, but we've also tried to engage with a variety of different topics over the years as new issues have arisen. So today, what we want to do is play a little bit of good cop, bad cop here. I'm going to say a little bit about some of the findings that we've had, and then Jeremy's going to talk about what this means politically and what this might mean for a coalition, a cross-party coalition that would support the family. One of the things that we've seen year after year is that though we live in a very polarized environment, one where we talk a lot about red and blue America, when it comes to day-to-day family life, red and blue families in the United States look very similar. And maybe this goes without saying, but both red and blue families love their children. We've been asking whether raising children is one of life's greatest joys. And if we look at people who have children under 18, 86% of Democrats say that they agree with that, at least to some extent, and 89% of Republicans also agree. Republicans are a little more likely than Democrats to strongly agree with the statement, but levels of disagreement are tiny, about 5% for both Democrats and Republicans. Both red and blue married parents report very high levels of relationship satisfaction. 87% of Democrats and 85% of Republicans who are married and have children under 18 say they're somewhat or completely satisfied with those relationships. They work on those relationships. About 7 in 10 Democrats and Republicans say that they discuss their relationship with each other at least monthly. They value their identities as parents or spouses or partners. This is Republicans and Democrats who are married and have young children. But you can see that they value, when we ask them about their identities, we ask them to tell us how important these various identities might be to them on a scale from 1 to 5. People really value their roles as parents and as partners, much more than they value their career roles or even religious identities. And for both Democrats and Republicans, far more than they say they value their partisan identities, something that we know as political scientists is very important to their political behavior. But they value their family-based roles much more. We've also been asking for the past decade about a variety of different things that families might do together: eat dinner, watch TV, do chores, worship, have arguments, go out together, attend each other's activities. And you can see that over time, right, there are some activities that families do together a lot every week: eating dinner, watching TV, doing household chores. And for those activities, there's really no partisan difference. Both Democrats and Republicans say that they eat together as a family at least weekly at about the same rate. And similar for other kinds of activities. I'm not showing doing chores, but there's no real partisan difference there, and there's no real partisan difference when it comes to watching TV or playing games together as a family. When we ask red and blue families to think about the challenges facing their own families, there really aren't big partisan differences there either. Though there are much bigger partisan differences when we ask them to think about families generally. And that's one of the things we've seen in a number of different questions. I'll show you one today. But in a number of different questions, we find that people give different responses when we ask them to report about their families versus when we ask them to think about the state of the family generally in the United States. So in this somewhat complicated figure, right? The circles are the 1,000 respondents who were randomly chosen to answer questions about their families, and the squares are the 1,000 respondents who were randomly chosen to answer questions about families generally. And you can see that when it comes to those circles, a lot of them are kind of in the middle, right? In purple, which means there's not a big difference between Republicans and Democrats. They have similar sets of, or they worry at similar rates about the stress and work demands of parents or the costs associated with raising a family. Democrats are a little more likely than Republicans to say that they worry about mental or physical health struggles within their families, and Republicans are a little more likely than Democrats to say that they worry about things like the loss of faith in their family. But in general, most of those circles are in purple. When we look at the set of people, again, randomly chosen, so these two groups are equivalent in the aggregate, very different when we ask people to evaluate families generally. There we see people's concerns about the challenges facing families are very much refracted through partisan lenses. So what I've tried to show is that the day-to-day life of families on the ground is pretty similar across partisan lines. We don't find that when it comes to attitudes about marriage. One, there is a marriage gap. Republicans are more likely than Democrats in our survey to report that they're currently married. That's been true across the 10 years. And that's not just a function of age, right? When we look at different age groups, that gap doesn't go away. So there's a difference in their likelihood of getting married. We've also been asking over the course of the 10 years a series of questions about marriage and about the value of marriage. Does it make families better off? Is it needed to create strong families? Is it old-fashioned and out of date? And you can see that if we go back, right, that fairly low percentages of Americans think that it's more of a burden than a benefit, or that it's old-fashioned and out of date. Majorities of Americans believe that marriage makes families better off, or that it's needed to create strong families. There are, however, some partisan differences. There's about a 13-point difference in 2024 between Republicans and Democrats in agreeing with the idea that marriage is old-fashioned and out of date. Those differences get differences of more than 35 percentage points in levels of agreement that marriage is needed to create strong families, or that marriage makes society better off. So there really is an attitudinal difference between the parties on marriage. One place where majorities of both Republicans and Democrats agree is that marriage helps children and families do better financially, or is important economically. There's still a gap there, but it's much smaller, and a majority of Democrats also agree with that statement. And that's important because other people on this panel have done incredible work on this, but we too find in this survey that marriage is correlated with a lower likelihood of having an economic crisis, like not being able to pay your bills, or having to move in with someone else because you can't afford housing, or not being able to go to the doctor, right? Married people are less likely than non-married people to have experienced those kinds of challenges. And the difference for married folks with children under 18 is about almost 20 percentage points. So there's truth to that attitude, to that agreement that marriage does help in terms of at least guarding against some of the biggest economic vulnerabilities that families face. So now I'm going to turn it to Jeremy.
As Chris mentioned, we do a good cop, bad cop thing in a number of environments, and I'm going to do that a little bit here because I'm going to talk about how things are going perhaps a little poorly. And the sense in which they're going poorly is that family, in our view, and I think there may be others who will share this, is in a little bit of danger at the moment. Fewer people are getting married. They take longer to get married. Even though the families that get formed are quite healthy and happy, there are reasons to worry about the future if fewer people make it into families and if that trend continues. And so I want to talk a little bit about policies. And the core fact that I hope you take away from my part of the presentation is that one problem is that the coalition that supports the family is split in an interesting way, potentially a problematic way, across the two parties. And I'm going to try to explain how that is true. I'm going to start with kids. And one of the survey, in fact, just a minute ago when we were talking in the back, Dan asked me what was I surprised by. And this was one of the things that surprised me, that if you ask people, do you think that government should, I guess I should know the right question wording, how much would you favor or oppose government spending money to promote each of the following actions to help families, even if it meant paying slightly more in taxes? We can talk in the Q&A about why we asked it that way. Only 23% of the public wants the government to encourage children. The clear message of that, I think, I don't want it to be one that the pro-natal crowd who wants people to have more kids are necessarily wrong, but the public is not interested in government doing this. So if it's going to be done, it needs to be done in a way that is more subtle than simply the government saying, oh, it would be great if we had more kids. The interesting thing about that number, as a point of contrast, in my opinion, is that the public is actually in favor of various things that support marriage. The public likes the idea of government doing things that will help people get married. Excuse me. And that obviously is connected to this. Now, we asked about a number of different programs. I'm not going to try to walk through the programs. And we asked people, do you think these help your family? Do they help families generally? And if you set the level, and in this particular graph, it's set very high. People here are responding, they thought it would be very helpful. Pretty much every program that we talked about, people thought that the government was doing, whether it was like spending on child tax credits or schools or other things like that, they thought it was very helpful in many ways. And so the government does see a role, or the public does see a role for government to play in helping people's families out. There is, however, a pretty significant partisan difference, and this leads me towards the difficulty in the coalition. Democrats are much more likely, and you could subset this to being liberals or other groups, but anyone on the political left, they love the idea of government helping families out through various welfare programs, spending on really almost anything. They think this is fantastic. Republicans are much more reluctant, though I would point out we've set the bar high here, and a quarter to a third of Republicans do strongly favor many of these programs. They think they would help families out. And this is where I want to get away from the survey data for just a second and say something about coalitions. I know you came here for survey data, but I'm just going to briefly talk about something else because we are political scientists. The US Constitution demands something that it never explicitly says. It demands that if you want to have a coalition that changes American politics or changes policy, you have to put together a coalition that is sizable and sustained. Yes, I'm going for the alliteration there with S words, but the idea is you can't just have a fly-by-night coalition that, and I'm just spitballing here, flies into Washington, changes a bunch of stuff, and then loses 2 years later in the midterm elections. I'm sure that's never happened before. Oh, wait, I actually made a graph showing how it happens all the time. This is partisan control over the last few years from 2016 up through 2024. And it's just a simple heuristic of showing you that we tend not to have big coalitions in government right now that last for a long time. I can show you longer graphs that are like this, and I spend this time with my students. The problem is that if we're going to support families, families live for a really long time. And people condition their family choices based on policies that have to stay in place for a really long time. So if government's going to have any sort of effect on what is going to happen with families, it can't just have a program for a couple of years or fire everyone in some government agency and somehow that will help families grow. I'm not, I don't have anything specific on that today. It has to do something that is sustained. Now, I'm going to skip over this so we can get to Q&A. I want you to take a look at these question items here. We asked people about whether or not government should do these things. And you'll notice here I've got a table where the rows are encouraging more two-parent homes for children and encouraging marriage. These are two areas where, though fairly large numbers of the public are in favor of government doing these things, it's people on the left, Democrats, and particularly liberal Democrats, who don't favor this. Only about a quarter do, or a third. The Democrats, and it probably doesn't say this as accurately as it should, it's all Democrats in this table, including the moderates, the married, and the church-attending ones. They're the ones who are much more in favor of simply encouraging two-parent homes. They are the groups that understand that marriage is good for families and that should be encouraged. That's one piece of the coalition that just kind of isn't there among Democrats. They are reluctant to promote marriage. If we go to Republicans, it's a little bit different. I don't think the differences are quite as stark, but it is the case that Republicans are a little more reluctant to spend on government and community programs and just support generally. And the numbers rise, again, when you look at moderate Republicans and church-attending Republicans. Now, generally, Chris and I try to discuss the data in ways that tend to just describe it descriptively. But we wanted to be a little bit more prescriptive in this 10th year, and we just want to talk for a second about blind spots that we see in the coalition that we think are problematic. This particular picture, you don't need this exactly, but it's a group of Democrats, I think, from South Carolina who are pushing programs to help kids in South Carolina. I have no idea if those programs are even good, actually, but the idea here is this is a very standard thing on the left where they're very much in favor of welfare for families or programs to help families. But what the left tends to have a blind spot about is simply encouraging marriage, even though, and I could point to some of the work of people on the stage here who can talk about how families lead to better equality, less poverty, better educational outcomes, all sorts of things. Many goals that if you are on the political left you have are aided by families. And it would be good if we could get the left to support that part of the coalition that says we really should be supporting families as much as possible. On the right, they have a different blind spot. I like this picture of Republicans with all of their hands raised because it sort of feels very Republican to me for some sort of reason. I'm not sure why. But their blind spot is being reluctant to support all these sorts of programs that families tend to think are good. Now, I'm not here to shill particularly for these programs, and I know we live in a time of straitened budgets where it's not going to be possible to pay for every single thing that's out there. But I think it is the case that the public is saying in survey data consistently that they would like some support for families. I suspect in particular families that are lower down the income scale, and Republicans are just more reluctant to do this. To have a coalition that really supports families, we are going to be required to have a somewhat difficult meeting of the minds. People who are not that interested in getting together with one another occasionally. That's why I have them looking apart from one another in this particular slide. They're not going to want to play well together. But our point today, and I'll close on this in a summary, is that if you want to support families, you need to figure out a way to get these two groups to come together and support a full spectrum family policy that talks about not just families are good, that there is, to reference Professor Carney's book, a two-parent family advantage, but you also need to get them to promote specific programs that will help those families. And if you don't do that, our concern is that in the long run, we'll continue to see fewer and fewer people getting married, more people putting it off, waiting, drifting, to the point where they're not able to actually form the kinds of families that they want. To sum up, our purpose in this 10th year has been to say, look, whether you're a red family or a blue family or somewhere in between, and there are lots of families in between, your day-to-day life is similar. It's pretty great. And families, though there are exceptions, and we're aware of that, tend to be a really great place for kids to grow up and good things to happen. But we think both parties have blind spots that, at least on current trend, are going to make it difficult to support families. And even though the trend away from family is small, it's real, And I think we should be paying attention to it and doing something about it before it becomes significantly more serious in the future. That's what we have to say. I don't know if Chris has a rebuttal. He might, because I am kind of a bad cop some of the time. But thank you for listening to us today.
Panelists, all right, so there's a lot to chew on here. I think I'd want to start, we talk a lot about families. There's obviously lots of types of families. And one of the things that I'm really interested in understanding a little bit better is where do you think the government we have now, where should they put their priority? Should the priority be family formation, that we should be stabilizing, for instance, working class men so they can become more marriageable? Should it be supporting existing families that are struggling? We know rates of mental health challenges that are increasing significantly among parents of young children. Where should the intervention be? And then what is possible? So how much of this has a particular political or policy solution versus a more sort of a cultural solution? Anyone?
Are you looking? Do you want to go?
I mean, I can start. I mean, I think what I would say is that we should be focusing more on working and middle class families, especially. I think that they're, upper middle class families, in part as Melissa Kearney's work suggests and Scott Winship's work suggests, have been doing quite well when it comes, generally speaking, when it comes to marriage and stable families. And we've seen actually the most erosion since 1980 in terms of like the two-parent married family among working class, in terms of if you look at kind of just the trends there. So I would want us to focus more on kind of measures that are going to be most likely to be supportive of working and middle class families. And I think when we have these sort of general discussions about family policy, we don't always kind of appreciate the fact that we actually already are spending a ton of money, and we are doing a ton programmatically to serve the lowest income families in our country. And when you talk to working class Americans, as we have in Ohio and Georgia, for instance, they often will express frustration that their friends, their family members, their neighbors, et cetera, kind of a little bit lower down the income ladder, actually getting a lot of things from the government, and they're not, because they're married or they're working more, whatever else. And so I would actually want us to think about policies and programs that are going to kind of reward people who are playing by the rules, who are working full-time, or have someone in their family member who's working full-time, who are married, who are kind of trying to do things in the sort of classic American way, and have the government kind of come alongside them and sort of acknowledge and help them with things like the child tax credit, but also kind of doing more creative things to address issues like affordable housing, for single family housing, for working middle class families. And we can talk more about that later, but I think we should be focusing more at this point in time on kind of strengthening the middle, broadly defined, when it comes to family and many other things too.
I'll pick up on, I will agree with the emphasis on targeting our efforts on working and lower class, lower and middle income families. I thought it was quite interesting that in the survey, when people were asked what the biggest challenges are facing families, it was economic challenges and costs came out on top, both when people were asked in general and about their own families, which suggests that some of these other cultural things that I admit, as the parent of teens, I worry a lot about, like, the time spent on screens and promiscuity and access to drugs and alcohol. Those did not strike people in your survey as the biggest challenges. So economic struggles we see are really important, and so I do think we need to do a lot more there. There's two places where I would deviate from what Brad said. One, I'm not in favor of framing things as giving more support to people who are playing by the rules. And I take what you mean by the rules, people who are married and working and doing things that we know protect them. Often people who look like they're not playing by the rules are people who have a lot of struggles, a lot of barriers, and need our help the most. And in particular, children growing up in those settings, which are millions of children, are faced with a lot of barriers to growing up to be the type of people who are going to be able to work full-time or access full-time employment or establish healthy relationships. And so I think it's counterproductive to frame this either as, do we want to support, single parent families more or married parents more? We need to support families and kids. And we need to do both of these things. It's a disgrace how widespread child poverty is in this country, an absolute disgrace. And kids who grow up in single-parent homes are much more likely to be growing up in poverty. We need to do much more to ameliorate their burdens. And if you want to think about it in terms of where their future is, we want to do that so they can grow up to be thriving adults. But at the same time, we need to break these cycles of disadvantage. And so we do need to be fostering and honest about the benefits of marriage. We do need to be honest about encouraging two-parent families, and supporting two-parent families is really important. So I think meeting families with where they are now and addressing their vulnerabilities while also undertaking the types of policies that will mean more men grow up to be, viewed as marriageable men, more children will grow up to have, to achieve a stable family, two-parent family. Those two things need to be happening at the same time.
If I can add to that, one of the things that I see in my work, both in research but also in the work I do in the community, I run a nonprofit for women and their families during pregnancy and postpartum. And we often see among those with the lowest income levels that they don't know what marriage is supposed to look like, right? It's hard to encourage something when people don't have a model for what that can be. And I think as we've seen over time, and as Brad was pointing out, we've seen a decline and more gaps in terms of marriage and healthy relationships between those with the lowest levels of education and income and those with the highest levels of education and income. And what I see so often as we work with women and families during this time is that it is remarkably eye-opening to suggest to them, if you would like to get married, we can help you do that. We can find ways to support you in that. You know how many of them want to get married? Nearly all of them. That is a dream that they have. It is part of American culture, and it is a desire that most people have. But so often we see that they don't have models. They don't believe that that is a possibility for them.
So I want to talk a little bit about some non-economic interventions for families. The research shows that overall, the number of Americans having weekly dinners together is relatively stable. Our research shows that, though, and I don't know if you guys have broken this out, that the percentage of young people today growing up and having regular family dinners, like every day, has declined fairly precipitously. And I know there's a lot of talk about how much social media and cell phones are a problem, particularly for teenagers. Are there ways for government to talk about some of these, perhaps non-economic interventions to help families and to encourage sort of more stability, within families? Anyone have any thoughts?
Oh, well, we've been involved in, that is Institute for Family Studies in part, and my colleagues there, including Michael Toscano, have been involved with efforts in Utah, where some of our guests are here from today, to kind of put forward a number of new measures to kind of help families navigate the kind of teens and tech space with new rules about how kids can access social media. And of course, we have seen also many states passing, for instance, age verification for pornography. So I think these are kind of just the beginning steps that states and hopefully the federal government are going to be taking to kind of, I think, to some extent limit our kids' access to, different media platforms and devices maybe even. And I think given kind of the fact that we're seeing to kind of, I think Jeremy's earlier point, we're seeing kind of dramatic declines in coupling and fertility, not just here obviously in the US, but across the globe. And it does seem like kind of our ability to sort of handle what I call kind of these electronic opiates is part and parcel of why people are kind of struggling to socialize, to date, to mate, marry, and have children. And so I think we're just beginning to think about how the government can kind of help us to navigate these new technologies, but also we need to have sort of civic initiatives and informal practices that help us to kind of put these devices and these technologies more in their place so we can kind of revive the practice of hanging out, dating, getting married, and having children.
Here, I can't help but give a shout out to Tim Carney's book, Family Unfriendly. Carney spelled different, no relation to me. But, and of course, I'm like, oh, we're a family. We have family dinner. And to talk about something that's in Tim's book, I'm like, oh, well, we won't have family dinner tonight because I have to drive my daughter to her travel soccer team practice at dinner time. And for those who have not yet read Tim's book, travel sports gets a lot of talk about how sort of anti-family it is. But, that kind of, what I love so much about Tim's book is really just talking about all of these less tangible ways that we make life difficult for families. Mm-hmm. Can they walk to places in their community, right? Do we carve out time for families to be together? I think also about the work of Claudia Golden, who writes about greedy jobs and the expectation that people be available at their jobs all the time. Those are really interesting margins to push on because it's less about government intervention and more about people being willing to say, this is the kind of society I want to live in. It's one where we say no to certain expectations of really demanding enrichment activities for kids, or no to expectations that work meetings happen at 6 or 7 p.m. And that's something I think, that's encouraging, actually, that we don't need the government to do anything about that. On this point, I found some of the findings in the survey really encouraging. One of the ones that you highlighted that I thought was really encouraging is just the overwhelming majority of Republicans and Democrats both who find raising children one of the most meaningful, joyful activities in their life, and the high share of both Republicans and Democrats who talk about their role as parents and spouses as a meaningful role in their life. I think there's a lot we collectively can do on the messaging on that. And I say this as somebody who spends my days with college-age kids and who's written about marriage and family, and so a lot of the young people I talk to or journalists I talk to, they all sort of unofficially want to say to me, but it'll be really, the women in particular, it'll be really hard for me to have a career if I have kids. And here I'll blame the economics profession. We're constantly advertising what is terribly labeled in our literature as the child penalty, which is, oh, women work less after they have kids. Women take an earnings hit after they have kids. Everyone knows that, but it's framed in a normative way that implies that, of course, you rather work than spend time with your kids. And the survey results suggest that actually people take a lot of meaning from being parents. And so this gets to, another way that how do we address these issues without government intervention? Let's just be honest that people derive a lot of pleasure from their roles as parents, and having kids is joyful. And so that doesn't necessarily make life easier for today's families, but I think it presents the topic of family differently to people who are contemplating having a family.
I want to point out here, and you guys correct me if I'm wrong, to perhaps throw a little bit of cold water on that. So you saw the similarities among Democratic families or Democratic parents and Republican parents. But single Democrats and single Republicans, I am guessing, are fairly far apart. And a lot of the research that I do, that I recently presented to Brad's class, is that you see single women in particular have views that are really significantly different than married women. So I'll give it for instance, and would love some comment or thought on it. So we found that a majority of single women, not a large majority, but a majority, think that single people are happier than married people. We found that almost half believe that most single men do not want an equal partner. So there's this sense of that you're hearing, Melissa. There's a sense of trepidation, I think, about what it'll mean if I get in a relationship with a partner who's not going to support my career or not support me in the way that I want, and then I'll have to face some sort of professional penalty for doing so. And relatedly, one of the things that we found in our work is that singles are more worried about marrying the wrong partner than no partner at all. They're far more comfortable being the idea of being alone than being with someone that is not right for them. So, given some of this messaging is occurring through social media and stuff that they're consuming online, the lack of models that some of them have, how do we get at some of this from like a cultural standpoint, right? That we're talking about not everything as a policy intervention, which is good, but the cultural piece seems almost more challenging to engage. I welcome any thoughts from any of you.
You know, I was thinking about that, Dan, as you shared the results about support for family policies by party, and I went through this in the document on page 51. When the word encouraging is used, encourage two-parent homes for children, Republicans higher than Democrats. When the word support is used, Democrats higher than Republicans. I don't think those words are actually that different, but I think it reflects something really important in how people view family. And part of what I've seen as a trend over time is that, you know, there is more openness to different families and what families look like. And I think partly what we're seeing in this is, and maybe this is more true for Democrats than Republicans, right? People don't want to be told what to do, but they want to be supported. And my view is that oftentimes when we work with people around these very issues, what they want and what they value is just what we would like them to do. And you know, the women I work with at our nonprofit, do they want to get married? Yes. They would like not to hear that they should get married because it's the best thing for their child, but they would like to know that it's a possibility and get support in reaching that goal. And I think it's really interesting to think about if we just change the wording in some of these, right? Encouraging marriage, supporting and encouraging marriage, might we get a more even number across Democrats and Republicans in that? And they really do seem like the same, two sides of the same coin to me. So my sense is we're not as far apart in some of these issues as it may seem when we look at these results. In fact, it's the framing that may matter most.
Go ahead.
No, I think that's a really important point, and I love the idea of experimenting more with question wording on some of this. But I do think part of what we see on the Democratic side is a reluctance to be seen as judgmental about
Absolutely.
any particular family form, and a desire to embrace lots of different relationship choices. And I do, but I also agree that so I think that's important. I think that's part of what's driving some of the differences we're seeing in attitudes about marriage, for example. Because when you ask Democrats what's important, they say, well, it's the commitment. That's what's the key thing, right? And the other thing that we've seen over time in terms of just getting into marriage is across the generations, really big differences in the sort of barriers or the milestones that people think need to be met before they actually enter into this relationship. And so if we look at the oldest cohorts, almost no barriers or milestones at all. Just get married when you're ready to get married, and when you want to get married. And younger Americans tend to see a need to own a home before you get married and have a number of other career-based milestones accomplished before those things happen.
I want to pick up on the importance of language and also acknowledge that I agree with the point that a lot of Democrats, in an effort to be inclusive and kind, don't want to suggest that one type of family is better than another. But empirically, in general, kids do a lot better if they were in a married parent family versus not. And empirically, in general, married parent households are much more financially secure. And it doesn't help anybody to pretend that that's not true. And even if there are low-income parents who don't want to hear that it's better for them if their kids get married, they probably need to hear it, because we do so much in this society to privilege or benefit the feelings of adults and whether they're chasing their own happiness. And I at least think people should go in very clear-eyed that you might be making this decision because you're not wildly in love with this person or because you want to do this by yourself. But let me just show you the data, and statistically, it's going to be a lot harder for you, and you're setting up your kids for more difficulties. I just think being honest about that, is the way everyone should do this. This is why, I found it quite jarring that only 58% of survey respondents said marriage makes families better off financially. Yeah. I mean, that should be close to 100%. That's just an empirical statement. Marriage makes families better off financially. Now, maybe that many people were thinking of the exceptions. Well, what if one of the partners gambles or is out of work consistently? Maybe there's some exceptions, but in general, as a general statement, that's just true. Now, I will say, it was something like only 57% of people agreed with the statement that marriage is necessary for strong families. I probably wouldn't have agreed with that statement either. Of course not. People can form strong families even without marriage, and a lot of people have no choice but to form strong families without marriage. And this, I think, speaks to the importance of language. We should be able to talk about this and be honest about the benefits of marriage and two-parent families without shaming people who don't have access to that, with acknowledging the many real barriers that people have to achieving that. And here's where the findings about policies that people support don't make sense. If Republicans want to be pro-family, they have to be more willing to support mental health treatment or support to low-income families so that people can thrive and flourish in a way that makes achieving stable relationships possible. And so I think there is a lot of room for a broad-based coalition, but it will require sort of an honesty about what we as a society should aim for, and it will require honesty about how much it will take to make achieving strong families more accessible to more people.
I agree with everything you just said. I would add, and I think Brad has noted this too, that relationship satisfaction is also higher among married people than those in sort of cohabitating relationships or other types of relationships as well. And I think the fundamental point about norms and the deterioration of norms is critical. I talked with UVA students over the past week, and so many, particularly the men, but both men and women, talked about the importance of getting my career started and finishing my education and doing all these things before, for some of them, it was before that I'll be attractive to a potential partner. There's word that they currently didn't have enough to offer, but at some point they would, where they'll earn enough money or they'll own an apartment or a car or whatever it is, and then they can go out and do that. And I think one of the things we're seeing, and I think your data showed this, ours too, is that dating and relationship experience in general is being delayed, right? So that Gen Z has far less romantic and dating experience than previous generations. We saw in our recent survey too that among those in college that there's less dating going on. Roughly 4 in 10 men graduating college have either no experience hooking up, dating, or in a relationship, which is much higher than previous generations. So I think the norms are really important there. So we're saying, no, what's going to be really critical to your happiness is your ability to form a committed, lasting, enduring relationship. I don't know if anyone else wants to sort of jump on that or has a different opinion.
Could I just throw it? We've been talking about non-economic or cultural interventions of some sort. Can I just throw out that I don't know that this should be seen I don't know that you can split those as cleanly as we might think about them being sometimes. We have effectively a cultural intervention in our country through education that dramatically promotes education to students, right? And this is good. I'm a college professor. I'm in favor of education. In general, I think people should get as much education as is appropriate for them. So that's good. But it would be nice if the government was out there being clear-eyed about some of the realities that Melissa Carney was just talking about and saying, these are things you should be aware of. No one's going to hear that in school, I think. That's just not a thing that schools are going to talk about. But they are going to hear that you'll have a terrible life if you don't get a BA from whatever sort of thing. I don't think there is a clean distinction between the economic and the non-economic interventions, given the way our society functions. And that's just one example of that kind of thing. So.
And I just wanted to pick up on something Melissa said, because you talked about thinking about the exceptions. And I think that that's true. Sometimes we have the wrong baseline in mind, or reason from the exceptions. And those exceptions are important, right? There really are relationships that are bad, or that are abusive, or that are problematic. But that's not the norm. And most people really value their experience as parents. They love their children. They want the best for their children, and they're having good experiences in their relationships. One of the things we did during the pandemic was look hard at loneliness. And what we found repeatedly is that the thing that mattered for loneliness is whether or not you were in a stable relationship. And if you were in a stable relationship, then you were less lonely. And so just talking about some of those things, and though the exceptions are important, and that there, again, I want to emphasize, there really are times when a marriage should stop, or that there's abuse that needs to stop, and is deeply problematic for children and others. That's not the experience of most people in their relationships. On average, they're happy, and they value those relationships very deeply.
Could I pick up on something Jeremy was mentioning, that this idea that you're taught that you'll do better if you go to college, get your bachelor's degree, but you're not taught about things like, whether being married before having children may be a better life plan for you. And one of the things we know from lots of research is that relationship education programs that teach those things and teach relationship skills do have a positive impact, both for high school, middle school students where they're taught in schools, but also for adults, right? We see positive impacts of those programs, preventing divorce among people who are already married, increasing family stability, even improving health outcomes for our program, for example, during pregnancy. And it's really remarkable that those programs are short. These are not lengthy, they don't have to be semester-long programs. They can be a day-long workshop. They could be integrated into food assistance programs. They could be integrated more into health classes in school, right, that are really teaching people what we know from both economics literature, from research on interventions like that, and we know that they have a positive impact overall.
I want to just pick up on this point about relationship education, because I think this way of looking at the challenge actually really helps when it comes to coalition building, in the sense that the way Galina frames it is, it takes skills to have a successful relationship. And one of the findings from your survey, which I don't think was highlighted in the short overview, was among couples, the biggest stressor in marriages was communication, right? And any of us who are in a relationship know that communication is constant, and it's hard, and it's a skill. And I think, this could be one reason why we see such higher rates of marriage and marriage stability among college-educated people. Just one, there's many, right? But the fact that it takes constant communication and skill of the kind that leads you to succeed in education and workplace settings is not irrelevant. And so when we think about encouraging marriages that way, to the point of a lot of people are just skittish by the word encouraging marriage, okay, why don't we help more people develop the skills required to have the kinds of relationship they want? Who would be against that, right? But that brings me to one final point, which is I want to speak specifically to messaging and a coalition building around the issue of where is feminism in all of this, okay? Because here's where, to my surprise, the most strongly negative reaction I got to my book, which is about the two-parent privilege and the decline of marriage, immediate and swift, came from feminist writers. How dare I say that like women couldn't do this on their own by, as well as men. And I was surprised and increasingly impatient over time by the feminist pushback, because the decline in marriage and the rise in single-parent families is not a feminist success story. And as both Brad and Lena mentioned, marriage is highest and two-parent families are highest among the most educated women. So those of us who have benefited most from an economic sense from feminism are also the ones most likely to be benefiting from strong and healthy relationships. So as feminists, we shouldn't like that there are so many women who don't think a marriage is in reach for them. So that's one view. On the other, I certainly, was interviewed by people who did like my book, but then wanted to blame feminism for this disaster we're in, and wanted to push me to say, now, don't you think it's better for kids if mom stays home? And if that's the view where we're going to set up marriage as anti-women working or women having to subjugate themselves, then we're not going to be pro-marriage, and we're not going to square that circle either. And so again, I point to the fact that it's not the most educated women, or it's not working women who are not enjoying the benefits of marriage. And so again, I think this is just really important to the sense of coalition building and the way we talk about it, because we should be able to be pro-family, pro-kids, and pro-women being successful on their own.
And we haven't actually talked too much yet today about kind of the male side of this whole issue. And I think it's just striking in the recent research that came out with Richard Reeves's new institute, kind of this showing that there's been almost no decline in marriage among college-educated women, but a lot more decline among less educated women. And that the big issue there is that, in part, is that the kind of men they have access to financially is quite different. So the college-educated women, including many feminist women, have access to more, often more educated, but certainly more kind of affluent or guys who have good jobs. And they're doing relatively well in this new economy, whereas women who are not having as much success when it comes to getting married, staying married, are women who are dating and socializing with guys who are not doing so well financially. And we know in the kind of broader public conversation, there's a kind of a male malaise where a lot of guys are not doing well in school, they're not doing well in the labor force, especially as they kind of move into their 20s and 30s. And as a consequence, they're less attractive as potential husbands. And you think about ways to kind of boost the fortunes of boys and men, and recognize that if we don't do that, we're going to continue to see this big class divide, which puts both those men at a disadvantage, but also the women in their lives and the kids that they have together. So that means, for instance, kind of, I think, revisiting how we approach schooling, having more recess, having more male teachers. It means thinking differently about the kinds of books we select for our kids' classes. It means doing more single-sex education. It means just rethinking education on a whole number of different levels to make sure we're kind of really capturing the minds and the imaginations and the hearts of our boys in school, and also doing more in vocational education, especially with an eye towards kind of opportunities locally for apprenticeships and things like that. It's just going to be much more attentive to kind of the need to do better on the boy front, but also to kind of give young men like a clear model of masculinity that's compelling to them and distinctive as well. This is where kind of it gets complicated in terms of how do we deal with a kind of a feminist set of concerns and concerns about equality, but at the same time recognize that for a lot of, I think, young men, if they don't have like a clear sense of their unique role in the world and the unique role in relationships and in the family and in marriage, they're going to be less likely to kind of invest both in relationships, but also kind of in the other things like schooling and work that would kind of prepare them to be good husbands and good fathers down the road. So this is a kind of a delicate task ahead of us in terms of bridging this sexual divide, but it's one that we need to do on a number of practical but also ideological levels today as well.
It does seem like the models, I think, for at least some of the models that are becoming increasingly popular in feminism and masculinity seem more antisocial than pro-social. There's an article recently about this idea of man-keeping, that women are being held back professionally because they're dedicating too many resources to helping their partners and spouses create social connection. And then the other side, there's like the manosphere, right, which is all about, look maxing and sort of thinking about yourself. And there's videos of like this guy going through a regimen and stuff from healthy living to, eating well and earning money. But it's all about sort of self-focused and none of it's sort of focused on helping other people or caring. And when you ask young people what the things that they prioritize and that it's important to them, it tends to be these kind of ideas of like sort of self-improvement and not, donating time to help my community or helping someone at my church or congregation. And a lot of that stems, right, from the way that we're raising, and I say this as a parent, what we're emphasizing, not just in school, but in the home, and what we're saying is important. And a lot of what kids are hearing is like, well, getting a good education, going to a good school, getting a good career is what you should value. And so that's what kids go out and they become adults, and that's what they do end up valuing. I want to have some time for questions, so maybe we'll turn to that now. Tim, I saw you were first out of the gate.
Always try. Thank you guys for bringing this survey again. And the individualism you were just talking about is what I was going to ask about, but instead I'm going to say, what's wrong with stay-at-home moms? I mean, I think that would be a good image to give men as far as something to work for. Communities benefit from it, and if our image of promoting families is just, well, we need to make sure that mom and dad, both working 40 hours a week, can also raise a family, we're leaving out a model that's favored by a lot of people and that has worked well for a lot of centuries. So do you have a problem with stay-at-home moms?
Yeah. If it came across that I was saying that the stay-at-home mom model is undesirable, I certainly didn't mean to. I was speaking, what I was referring to was more socially conservative interviewers who basically wanted me to say, and not only is marriage good for kids, but marriage where moms stay home is the model we should have in mind. And my read of the literature and the evidence is that the reason that kids do so well when there's two parents is because parents have more resources. And I'm agnostic, both in terms of my read of the literature and my personal position on this, I'm agnostic as to how two parents decide to make that work. Whether one wants to work full-time and one stays home, whether they both work part-time, whether they alternate who works full-time, whether they both work full-time, in the language of economists, they have more degrees of freedom to do what works best for their families. In terms of policies, I would also favor policies that are agnostic about that and basically relax the constraints on families so that they can make their choices. This is why, for instance, if forced to choose between an expanded child tax credit and subsidized childcare, I favor expanded child tax credit. Because then families can use that how they think works best for their family. So I don't think anything is wrong with stay-at-home moms. I don't think anything's wrong with stay-at-home dads. I don't think anything's wrong with both parents working. I think, my point about coalition raising was, if we are going to insist on a type of marriage or a view of marriage, you're going to lose some of the coalition.
Yeah, that's true.
Thanks for this discussion, Carl Polzer. My question has to do with differences between men and women. For example, I often hear in these discussions unmarriageable men, but I never hear unmarriageable women. So that's a concept in the back of one's head that one might bias these types of studies. So how do you define an unmarriageable man versus a woman? Are they the same definition? Is it because they can't make enough money? Is there some kind of unconscious bias there?
So I think one thing in terms of the marriageable man question is we have seen for instance, in Pew polling, that it's still the case even today in the 21st century that women more than men are looking for a spouse who works full time. So I think certainly thinking about kind of full-time work as part and parcel of the broader package that you would associate with a marriageable man, I think is somewhat distinctive. And a marriageable woman, I think, would be, I don't think we have as clear an idea kind of in the culture about what that is or even empirically what that is. But I would sort of think about it in terms of, kind, respectful, responsible, kind of has their act together kind of thing. But the work piece, I think, is much more still, even now, linked to men's marriageability.
The only thing I just want to say is that that term, the reason why social scientists use that term, it really dates back to the sociologist William Julius Wilson, who wrote in the 80s trying to explain the gap in marriage and family structure between black and white families. And he coined this concept of a marriageable male pool index, where he was looking at basically the share of men in your demographic group who were working. And so that's where that term came from, and we use it probably too loosely very frequently as social scientists.
Thanks so much. This is a fabulous conversation. Really appreciate the perspectives that you brought. My name is Chris Hull, and I'm a senior fellow in the Master's in Public Policy program at Catholic University. I was wondering, there's something that's being, I think, to some extent danced around, and I wanted to give you a stark example of it. When I was 2 years old, my father took his own life, and so my mother became a widow. And she was put on supplemental security income, SSI, which is part of the safety net, which was created by FDR. And FDR specifically said that cash welfare was a narcotic and that it was dangerous to be doing that. But in that particular case, especially in the 1930s, it made all the sense in the world, because women could literally starve to death if their spouse died during the Depression. Here's the problem. When I was 16 years old, I remember very clearly, my mother was still unmarried, and she specifically told me that the reason that she wasn't getting a job, even though she had a nursing degree, was because she would lose her benefits, and that she would never be able to get them back. That's 14 years later, and she did not remarry until I was 27 years old. So, what I would suggest is, when the theorists from the 1960s, who were talking about disrupting the two-parent family, and today, by the way, all the way through, when they're talking about disrupting the heteronormative couple, when they're talking about let's do what we can in order to disrupt the two-parent family because it's oppressive of women, that's worked. That happened. In other words, the policies of the Great Society broke families up, and they were intended to break families up. So here's the question for you. To what extent is providing cash welfare, especially to unmarried women with children, facilitating their lack of marriage, their lack of childbearing, and poverty? And to what extent should we be decreasing support for unmarried women and, by the way, unmarried men making them unmarriageable because they're on welfare?
Yeah, can I go? So cash welfare support for anybody in this country other than the elderly is extremely meager. So very few single moms and their kids are getting by reliant on cash welfare. So if you just look at single mother households, 88% of their household earnings household income on average comes from their earnings. The issue that you raise was litigated in the 1996 welfare reform. So the aid to families with dependent children, which back in the 60s and 70s required that there not be a husband or man in the house, fortunately those rules were changed. So that's no longer the rule. And then welfare reform in 1996 had very, very explicit pro-marriage aims. And so it's no longer the case where there are explicit penalties. Having said that, our safety net, because like our tax code is based on family income, there are implicit marriage disincentives. So for instance, much more important to single mother households than cash welfare, which really is very, very meager these days, is Medicaid. So a majority of single moms rely on Medicaid. But it's such that if, we basically put these moms and their kids in a really difficult choice. If they marry the father of their child and he's working and they double their income, she's likely to lose Medicaid. So you could think of that two ways. I see that and I say, we need to make Medicaid more generous so that people aren't faced with having to choose for, public health insurance versus marrying the father of their child. You might look at it and say, we shouldn't provide health insurance for single moms and their kids so that she has to go find a husband who might be able to give her health insurance. That, to me, strikes me as completely the wrong way to do this. Health insurance support for low-income kids is very protective. A lot of these women aren't making the choice between, oh, here is this stably employed man who wants to take care of me versus a government, checker program. But do I think that we should, work to eliminate these penalties? Yes, I do.
And I would just add on the kind of the marriage penalty front, we had a discussion in this very room a little while ago with some folks from Sutherland, again in Utah, who've done a survey on this question and found that for low-income Utah residents or citizens, particularly kind of both the Medicaid piece that Melissa was just touching on, and also the SNAP or the food stamps piece, were kind of the two most salient kind of programs that lower income people were kind of seeing as obstacles or barriers for them today to getting married. So I think in terms of trying to figure out some way, some bipartisan way to address marriage penalties might mean kind of reducing, some of the thresholds for some, because there's a lot of programs. It's not just Medicaid. There's, there's obviously food stamps. There's, many, many programs now that are touching the lives of lower income families. And in total, what they end up doing, unfortunately, is in terms of how they're structured, is they're penalizing both marriage and also work, as your own mother's kind of experience suggests in today's world. So I think we need to be thinking about new ways to reduce the penalties that a lot of these programs now basically inflict unintentionally on working class families with kids especially, and to think about ways to reduce the cliffs and to minimize or eliminate that marriage penalty.
And if I could add to that as well, I come at this from a different angle, I think, in terms of thinking about what services we can provide in that. And as you're pointing out about welfare reform, 1996, it is very pro-marriage and pro-two-parent households. You know who doesn't know that? The people who receive welfare. They don't know that because they don't get the messages. We are here to support you or encourage you in raising a family in a married household, right? They're not getting skills or education or even just messages that are pro-family or pro-marriage as they're receiving those benefits. And I think that there could be ways for us that are pretty low cost to layer in some of the reasons why these programs exist, and to truly support or encourage people to be able to have the families they want and deserve to have. But they get a check, they get food at the grocery store. None of that is actually pro-family messaging that's involved. So I think there may be ways for us to think about really doing more work in incorporating messages that are pro-family, pro-marriage into those benefits that, and I don't think that costs a lot. It's a little bit of a shift in mindset to think about doing that.
I actually have a question from Goldie Brown, who emailed us, and she said, Galina, thank you for highlighting that there are areas across this country where individuals, particularly from low socioeconomic backgrounds, lack examples of healthy marriages in their upbringing or environment. What strategies are being implemented to address this reality? Are there specific programs on a national level, educational incentives, or religious institutions that are making a difference?
That's a great question, Goldie. Yes is the answer. There's federal funding for healthy marriage and responsible fatherhood programming, and pretty good evidence that a lot of those programs really make a difference, and they are reaching hundreds of thousands of people and couples with relationship education. And I like the comment about churches. What we see in so many communities is the church communities are the fabric that holds a community together. I'm doing some work in Memphis, Tennessee right now, and what they are doing in terms of supporting and promoting marriage and relationships is all through the churches, right? And it's making such a difference. In just 1 year of their program, they have provided relationship education to more than 4,000 people, right? And that was from one facilitator training. They got together a bunch of people from different churches who have then gone out and disseminated those programs to other people in their communities, all through a network of churches. And so I think there are a lot of great programs out there, and there's really strong research happening and evidence that they do make a difference.
Can I just add to that, just to highlight something Jeremy talked about in his portion of the presentation, is that it's church attenders who are very well positioned to help us create this broad-based coalition as well. That's where we see significant overlap between Republicans and Democrats. It's among those who are attending church, and that's probably because they're having experiences on the ground in this way, but they're also thinking about this problem in a way that's distinct and that I, again, think positions them to be bridge builders and to be coalition builders if we're talking about a broad-based coalition for families.
Great, John Fortier from AEI. My question is following up on the last one, but just maybe much more specific. There are a lot of faith churches which have very specific kind of pre-marriage programs, and some of them are not insubstantial. I went through them, and it takes some time, and they're. Have we studied these things? Do they work? And if they work, are there particular skills that those types of programs are teaching that are particularly useful?
I'm happy to answer that question. Yes, they work. There are meta-analyses, many publications showing that either those premarital skills programs or relationship education that might be given at different stages in marriage or relationships, that they do impact couples. And it seems like one of the things that is core to many of those is what you were highlighting, communication, right? Being able to communicate well through conflict, through disagreements, but also encourage strong bonds between partners, between spouses, with children. And we know those are skills that many people today don't grow up seeing. Especially in lower income families where there's been more and more breakdown of marriage, and there truly is great evidence that those kinds of programs tend to have a really positive impact for families.
All right. Well, please join me in thanking our presenters and our panelists, and thank you all for coming.